Welcome, friend. You've found your way back to boring history for sleep, the quiet corner of YouTube where history hums gently in the background while your eyelids get heavier. Settle in now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that cozy background hum. If you enjoy these gentle time travels, do feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy it. And leave a comment if you like. Where in the world are you re-listening from, and what time it is as you drift into this strange Victorian dream. And now, let's step softly into another age. Imagine yourself waking up not in your own bed, but in the bustling heart of 19th century Britain, a world where love was wrapped in lace, ruled by etiquette and whispered behind fans. Tonight, you'll wander through the courtships, customs, and curiosities of love and dating in Victorian times. You wake to the kind of light that is not quite bright, but still insists on seeping through lace curtains, filtered by soot from the coal fires that never seem to stop burning in Victorian London. It's not the sunshine of holiday postcards, it's a more hesitant glow, diluted as though it's had to fight its way past too many chimneys to reach you. The air in your bedroom is cool, carrying a faint edge of dampness, and you can already tell that breakfast is somewhere. Downstairs, probably involving porridge and toast that will taste faintly of the coal smoke that has flavored everything you eat. You sit up, stretch stiffly. And remember, today is not just another day of polite small talk and carefully scheduled meals. Today could be a day when someone leaves their calling card downstairs. And in the Victorian world, a calling card is never just a piece of paper. It is a telegram of intent, a whispered suggestion wrapped in good quality cardstock, embossed with a name and looping script that you cannot quite take your eyes off. The ritual begins quietly. You make your way down to the hallway, slippers whispering on the wooden floor, and there it is, the tray. Silver, polished so often, it has developed its own weary gleam. The tray is deceptively simple, just a resting place for paper. But it is also, in a way, your diary, your social resume, your personal advertisement board. One card in the tray means someone has thought of you. 2 cards mean competition. A stack of them is enough to make the chaperones sharpen their spectacles. Pick one up, hold it to the morning light, and try to guess. Is this man tall, short, good-humored, tedious? The card does not say. It only announces his existence. If you find it dull, that romance in this era starts with paper rectangles. Remember, our own swiping left and right is not much different. It's just less expensive, less perfumed, and far less elegant. The hallway where you stand is silent, except for the ticking of the tall grandfather clock. That steady rhythm is not just keeping time, it's keeping count of how long this card will sit unacknowledged. Because in Victorian etiquette, silence speaks louder than any reply. If the card is accepted, a parlor visit may follow. If it lingers untouched, the message is clear. Try elsewhere, good sir. You notice your fingers linger on the edge of the tray, brushing against the cool silver, as though you might absorb some of the power it carries. For you, it is both a beginning and a test. There is a peculiar thrill in realizing that someone has left their name for you, written formally, but meaning something much less formal. I wish to know you. Or at least I wish to know if knowing you would be socially advantageous. It is romance, but measured with a ruler. Upstairs, the sounds of morning continue, doors creaking open, maids bustling, the muffled call of a coal delivery in the street. Outside, the wheels of carriages clatter over cobblestones slick from last night's drizzle. Inside, the world is paused on the promise of paper. You slip the card into your hand, imagining the man who handed it to a servant with the right balance of casualness and hope. Did he practice the gesture? Did he hesitate? Did he smooth his hair afterward, wondering if it looked just so? The weight of the card is light, but the meaning is heavy. As you carry it back to your room, you notice how easily the day has already shifted. You woke in a soot-filtered room. Now you are in a story. It is a story told through ink and cardstock, through trays and polite silences. You may think it lacks passion, but there's a strange charm in the formality. You cannot simply blurt feelings. You must layer them, like the corsets and waistcoats you button each morning. Sitting once more at your small writing desk, you place the card in front of you. Its edges are sharp against the wood. Let yourself smile, not broadly. Of course, that would be indecorous, but faintly, privately. Perhaps later today there will be the parlor, the music, the carefully monitored conversation. But for now, it is morning, and the day is only beginning. And as you lean back in your chair, listening to the distant rumble of carts outside and the rustle of the household beginning its routines, you realize that this tray in the hallway is more than an ornament. It is the first act in a carefully staged performance. And you, whether you like it or not, are already on the stage. From this quiet beginning, your eyes wander once again to the card itself. You think about its neat lettering, the crisp feel of the paper, and the strange way that ink on cardstock can change the trajectory of a life. It may seem small, even dull, but this is how romances begin in Victorian times. Not with sudden declarations, but with subtle introductions. And soon enough, the tray and its little stack of invitations will lead you where so many Victorian hearts went next, into the ritual of the calling card itself, a dance of paper and propriety that decides who is allowed to step through the doorway and who must remain politely at the curb. You step softly back into that quiet hallway, where the air feels cooler than the rest of the house, as though it knows its role as one of pause and ceremony. There is the tray again, gleaming silver, perfectly placed on a narrow table beneath a looking-glass. It might seem at first like just another ornament, the sort of furniture that stands around doing nothing in a Victorian home. But here, in this narrow space, it is the stage where every hopeful romance first performs. A calling card is small, stiff, and rectangular, embossed with the owner's name in curling script. Occasionally, there's a flourish, perhaps a crest or an address, but rarely more than that. No smiling portrait. No witty tagline. No profile picture taken at just the right angle with just the right filter. Instead, you hold a piece of thick card that says one thing, and one thing only. Here I am. This is my name. Do with it what you will. The ritual has rules. Too many rules, you might think, though Victorians seem to love stacking rules atop each other, until the whole thing resembled a Jenga tower of etiquette. If you are a gentleman, you never hand a card directly to a young woman. That would be far too forward. Instead, you present it to a servant who deposits it delicately on the tray. If she, or more precisely her family, approves, the card is kept. If not, it may vanish mysteriously, carried away by the same servant, as though it never existed. A whole week's courage can be erased with one discreet flick of the wrist. Even the position of the card carries meaning. It's placed neatly right side up. It suggests an interest worth considering. Turned down, folded at a corner, or quietly tucked away. That is social code for rejection, the polite Victorian version of ghosting. At least in this system, you know where you stand. There is no agonizing over whether your message has been read. The tray tells you everything. As you watch, you imagine the parade of cards left over the years, some dropped with confidence, others with trembling hands. Names carved into copper plate lettering that hint at fortunes, titles, or sometimes debts, artfully concealed. You can almost hear the faint sighs of suitors who never made it past this very hallway, their names resting briefly in silver before disappearing into the drawer of oblivion. For the young woman of the house, sorting these cards is a strange kind of entertainment. Imagine sitting in the drawing room, shuffling them like a deck of possibilities. This one belongs to a gentleman with property in the north, promising this one, a charming fellow with no discernible income. Less so. Another with a noble title, but also a questionable reputation. The cards become like a hand of chance, where love and strategy shuffle together. And yet there is something oddly tender about it all. That moment when a card is picked up and carried upstairs feels like a secret door opening. Someone out there noticed you, cared enough to leave a piece of themselves behind, hoping it might be accepted. It's romance by proxy, a thing passionate, nothing bold, but still a quiet flutter of possibility. You cannot help comparing it to modern times. Today, a text can vanish without reply, swallowed by the black hole of digital silence. A message read but ignored feels brutal. But here, rejection is dressed in ceremony. Card disappears, the tray is empty, and the message is delivered without a word spoken. Brutal, yes, but dignified. There is, of course, a social hierarchy built into this tray. A family of high standing may receive dozens in a week, while others might wait months for a single embossed rectangle to appear. The tray gleams with importance, like a scoreboard of desirability. You can imagine the quiet competitiveness among families, each hoping their daughter's tray will groan with suitors, and each daughter secretly hoping at least one of those cards belongs to someone who makes her laugh. The ritual is not without comedy. Picture a nervous gentleman rehearsing the moment, card in hand, only to stumble on the step and fling it into the umbrella stand. Or a servant, weary of the endless parade of would-be suitors, who stacks the cards carelessly and forgets to pass them along. Romance, it turns out, can be undone not by passion or betrayal, but by human clumsiness. Still, when the ritual works as intended, a card accepted means one thing: an invitation to the parlor, a chance to step inside, sit on the edge of a well-cushioned chair, and begin the cautious game of words under the sharp gaze of a chaperone. And so you linger in the hallway, feeling the cool weight of the silver tray, listening to the faint sounds of life beyond. The piano warming up in the next room, the rustle of skirts, the creak of furniture being arranged just so. The ritual has done its work. The card has been accepted. You step softly into the parlor, the room already humming with expectation, though nobody is yet speaking. The air carries the faint perfume of beeswax polish on mahogany furniture, mingled with the sharper edge of coal smoke sneaking in from the fire. Cushions sit plump and ready, as if they too are bracing for the delicate theater of courtship. This room is not simply a space for comfort, it is a stage, and every piece of furniture is a prop. The chairs are arranged not haphazardly, but with strategic intent. They are placed at polite angles, close enough for conversation, yet far enough to discourage anything resembling intimacy. You settle into one, feeling the rigid support of upholstery that seems designed less for relaxation than for posture. Across from you, another chair waits for the visitor, positioned so that both of you are in clear sight of the third presence in the room, the chaperone. Always there, always watchful, usually with knitting in hand or a book in lap, but never fooled by appearances. A chaperone's ears are sharper than her needles, and her eyes glance up more often than her spectacles suggest. Conversation begins with small talk, the weather, as always. The state of the roses in the garden, a recent concert perhaps, or a new book whose pages everyone has skimmed, but nobody has finished. You speak lightly, testing the air, measuring the responses. Too much enthusiasm looks desperate, too little looks cold. Each word is chosen as carefully as the cutlery at dinner. And yet, beneath the polite chatter, there is a low hum of unspoken thought. You catch yourself studying the angle of a hand resting on the arm of a chair, the slight lean forward when a question is asked. It's the way the visitor's boots squeak faintly against the polished floorboards. These are details the chaperone might ignore, might not. You cannot know. The whole thing feels a little like a chess game in which your opponent is smiling at you, while also announcing your every move to the crowd. The parlor itself adds to the performance. A piano gleams in the corner, not only as decoration but as a test of talent. Sheet music waits on the stand, daring someone to fill the silence with melody. A bookshelf offers volumes of poetry and sermons, all carefully selected to showcase refinement. Even the wallpaper seems complicit, patterned in a way that suggests seriousness and respectability. Though if you stare long enough, you wonder whether the vines and flowers are laughing quietly at the seriousness of it all. You imagine yourself speaking with perfect politeness, while secretly longing to ask the real questions. Do you snore? Do you laugh at silly things? Do you care about the poor? But these are not parlor topics. In this room, the rules forbid frankness. Instead, you tilt your teacup just so. You compliment the arrangement of flowers. You ask whether Chopin is preferable to Mendelssohn. And you hope the pauses between sentences are interpreted as thoughtful, not awkward. The most daring move available to you might be a shared glance too brief for the chaperone to scold, but long enough to say what cannot be said aloud. A glance is both safe and risky, as if your entire future is suspended on the twitch of an eyelid. You wonder whether modern texting, with all its emojis and abbreviations, is really any clearer. At least with a glance, nothing is left to the archives. The room grows warmer as the fire crackles. Someone coughs politely. The chaperone looks up, then down again, satisfied or perhaps simply biding her time. The silence stretches, filled only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. And then, at last, another question. Have you read the latest serialized novel in the magazine? You haven't, but you nod, because the truth is less important than the smooth continuation of conversation. It may all feel contrived, this parlor performance, and yet within these rehearsed exchanges lies something quietly sincere. Beneath the stiffness and the layers of etiquette, two people are trying, in their careful way, to discover whether they can bear each other's company for the rest of their lives. It is not passion as you know it, but it is persistence, and persistence has a power of its own. As the conversation winds on, you glance again at the polished piano, its keys gleaming in the firelight. You know that sooner or later someone will suggest a tune. And in Victorian parlors, music often said what words could not. Before you even step into the parlor, before the calling cards are exchanged or the glances are attempted, there is the matter of dressing. In the Victorian world, romance begins not with words but with fabric. Every stitch, every button, every lace trim is part of a conversation spoken in silk and wool. You do not simply get dressed, you construct an argument for your worthiness. For women, this means layers upon layers. You begin with the chemise, that simple, soft garment against the skin.
Oh.
Though by now it feels less like underwear and more like the calm before a storm. Then come the corsets. The tightly laced marvels of engineering that compress your body into the hourglass shape demanded by fashion. Breathing becomes a luxury, and bending is a challenge. But at least you can feel confident that your waist looks suitably petite, provided you do not collapse mid-conversation. Congratulations, your ribs may now double as percussion instruments. Over the corset goes the crinoline or bustle, depending on the decade. These contraptions give your skirts the sweeping volume that announces your presence before you even enter the room. Walking requires practice, like maneuvering a small stage curtain attached to your hips. Sitting down gracefully is a skill in itself, one not taught but expected, like knowing which fork to use at dinner or how to feign attractively. At last, the dress itself. Fabrics chosen for quality, color chosen for symbolism. Pale hues speak of youth and modesty, darker shades of sophistication. Embroidery, whispers of wealth and attention to detail. Gloves, always gloves, hide the hands but reveal refinement. And jewelry, though restrained, offers subtle messages. A brooch pinned just so, or a locket containing a strand of hair, could suggest sentimentality, or loyalty, or more simply, access to a good jeweler. For men, the ritual is no less demanding. Begin with the shirt, stiff-collared, starched to a degree that could probably deflect small weaponry. Then the waistcoat, chosen to display both taste and restraint, for anything to bold risk scandal. Trousers are fitted, polished shoes shine as if they have never met mud, and the cravat or tie becomes a battlefield of knots. One wrong fold and you risk looking less like a gentleman and more like a distracted clerk. The jacket, tailored and severe, completes the look. An exclamation point in wool, and of course the hair. Pomade ensures not a single strand dares escape formation. Together, these outfits transform ordinary people into almost statuesque figures. You feel the weight of clothing not only on your body but on your behavior. The corset keeps you upright, the collar keeps your chin lifted. The layers of fabric keep your gestures measured and deliberate. Your clothing controls you as much as you control it. The message is clear. Appearance is morality. If you look respectable, then you are respectable, or at least that is the hope. The rituals of dressing also extend into small, silent competitions. Whose dress rustles with more silk? Whose shoes gleamed with greater polish? Whose bonnet has traveled the furthest from Paris? These details are noticed, even if never spoken aloud. Fashion is not about comfort, it is about communication. You're announcing to the world, I belong to this class, this circle, this tier of society. And if someone across the room is impressed, so much the better. Yet beneath the careful elegance, you remain aware of the absurdity. You cannot sit comfortably. You cannot walk quickly. You cannot laugh too hard, lest your collar dig into your throat or your corset protest. Even raising a teacup becomes a delicate maneuver, for one careless drip of liquid on lace, and your entire ensemble feels ruined. And still, you persist, because the uniform of love is as binding as the corset itself. When at last you step into the parlor, you do not merely enter, you debut. Your clothing has already introduced you. The shine of your shoes, the sheen of your silk, the height of your collar all speak before you open your mouth. It is theater, yes, but theater with very high stakes. And as you settle into the stiff chair, exchanging pleasantries under the chaperone's watchful eye, you are already planning the next outfit. Because tomorrow may bring another visit, another parlor stage, another chance to be noticed. And if the outfit holds their gaze just a moment longer, perhaps that is victory enough. The clothes may speak, but eventually someone will need to provide the soundtrack. Which is why the piano waits patiently in the corner, ready for its role in the courtship performance. Once the parlor visits have been endured, once the polite nodding and carefully timed laughter have been exchanged, there comes a quieter battlefield: the letter. In the Victorian era, a love letter was not a casual text dashed off between errands. It was a crafted performance, rehearsed on paper, with every flourish of ink carrying the weight of your reputation. Writing a love letter was less about saying what you felt and more about saying it in a way that society allowed: flowery, cautious, and utterly legible. You sit at the writing desk, a candle flickering beside you, and the air faintly smells of ink and beeswax polish. The paper itself is no afterthought. Stationery is chosen with care. Heavy cream paper if you want to appear serious, delicate floral embossing if you lean toward the romantic. Even the quality of the envelope matters. A cheap envelope can undo the finest prose. Imagine pouring your heart into perfect cursive, only to have the recipient mutter pity about the paper. The ink, of course, is temperamental. It blots, it smears, it splatters on your sleeve when you least expect it. The pen must be dipped again and again, forcing a rhythm upon your words. Each dip is a pause, a chance to rethink a phrase that might be too forward or not forward enough. Perhaps you write yours devotedly and stare at it until the ink dries, wondering if yours sincerely would be safer. The Victorians had entire manuals advising on such matters, because romance could hinge on the difference between affectionately and most affectionately. You find yourself rehearsing metaphors: love compared to roses or the moon, or perhaps to a guiding star, though that one is rather overused. To the modern ear it may sound unbearably saccharine, but to a Victorian recipient it was expected. To be plain was to be careless, and to be careless was to risk scandal. Your handwriting becomes the mirror of your soul. A flourish here, a steady line there, proof that you are both passionate and disciplined, ardent but respectable. One accidental ink blot, and suddenly you are not the picture of refinement but a person with sweaty palms and bad motor control. And then there are the practicalities. A letter must pass through the postal system, where curious eyes might pry. Privacy is a fragile thing in a world where servants handle the envelopes, and nosy siblings might intercept. Clever lovers resort to codes or initials, weaving messages that only the intended reader could fully decipher. A single pressed flower tucked into the fold might say more than paragraphs of purple prose. Of course, a pressed flower also risks leaving a suspicious stain on the paper, leading to awkward explanations. Love, it seems, is always a gamble. The arrival of a reply is its own drama. The knock of the postman, the thump of the envelope, the tremor in your hands as you break the seal is theater disguised as routine. Inside, the looping script could either lift your spirits for days or plunge you into gloom. A single sentence, cautiously worded, might be analyzed a dozen ways. Did "with deepest regards" mean affection, or was it simply polite dismissal? The ink is hardly dry, and already you are rereading, decoding, inventing meanings. Still, for all the hazards of ink blots and ambiguous wording, the love letter carries an intimacy unmatched by parlor performances. In a letter, you dare to reveal what cannot be said aloud beneath a chaperone's gaze. You can linger, revise, and risk a softness too fragile for public view. Letters are in their way, more honest than appearances, though filtered through layers of etiquette and metaphor. So you write, and you wait, and you blot and sand the ink carefully to avoid smudges. You fold the paper with precision, slip it into its envelope, and seal it with wax that carries your initials. The letter is now less a message than an artifact, a piece of yourself carried into someone else's hands. And should that someone respond, your connection deepens, ink line by ink line. Yet all the careful words, all the blotting and the sealing, all the pressed flowers and coded metaphors, none of it will matter unless you have somewhere suitable to exchange these tokens. Which brings you naturally to the promenade, where love steps out into the open air. There comes a point when the parlor visits and the folded letters, though charming, no longer suffice. You and your would-be partner must venture into the world if only for the length of a stroll. This is called walking out, and it is a milestone not to be underestimated. In the Victorian vocabulary of romance, walking out together is as close as one might get to being publicly recognized as a couple, without the ink still drying on a marriage certificate. To walk side by side is to announce, without words, that something is quietly forming. The streets themselves conspire to shape the experience. You picture yourself stepping onto a cobblestone lane or a gravel path in the park. The air carries a mix of horse manure, chimney smoke, and, if you are lucky, the faint perfume of lilacs drifting from a garden. Not exactly a cinematic backdrop, but in its way, it is all the more real. Your shoes scuff the gravel. The woman's skirt whispers like a bellows with each step. The rhythm of the walk becomes a language all its own. You never walk alone, of course. A chaperone trails a few feet behind, perhaps a sibling or an aunt whose job is to keep the outing wholesome. Her gaze may wander toward shop windows or passing carriages, but her presence is a reminder. Affection must stay within the boundaries of propriety. You may not take your companion's hand, but you might offer an arm, and she may rest her gloved hand lightly upon it. The weight of that touch, filtered through fabric and etiquette, can feel more electric than any embrace. Conversation during a walk is careful and measured, though the illusion of privacy makes it easier to speak than in a crowded parlor. You talk of books, of sermons, of the weather, always the weather, and of music recently heard. To the untrained ear it sounds trivial, but beneath the small talk, coded signals are exchanged. When your companion says she admires roses, perhaps she is hinting at the kind she might like delivered. When you mention an interest in travel, perhaps you are gently suggesting horizons that stretch beyond the current street. Every remark carries potential double meaning. The promenade is also a stage for observation. Other couples may be walking out as well, and each stroll becomes a parade of impressions. Who looks suitably matched? Who is walking a little too quickly, or laughing a little too loudly? Appearances are noted, whispered about later over tea. The walk is never entirely private. It is a public ritual dressed as leisure. And yet, within that ritual, the smallest gestures can feel monumental. A shared glance at the passing clouds. Pause to watch the ducks at a pond. A moment where silence stretches but does not collapse. Clothing, once again, plays its part. Heels catch on cobblestones, parasols twirl, hats are tipped just so. The weather might conspire against you, a sudden breeze lifting veils, or a drizzle that demands the gentleman's umbrella, but these inconveniences offer opportunities. To shield someone from rain or to steady them on uneven ground is a chance to demonstrate attentiveness without breaking decorum. These gestures matter, precisely because they must remain understated. As the walk draws to a close, you feel both the satisfaction of companionship and the faint ache of its brevity. A chaperone clears her throat, the gates of a home swing open, and with a polite bow or curtsy, the moment is suspended until the next outing. Part with no embrace, no whispered promise, but the memory of shared steps lingers long after the gravel has quieted underfoot. And so walking out, modest though it may seem, becomes the architecture upon which further affection is built. It is rehearsal for a life lived side by side, slow, deliberate, constrained, but nonetheless intimate. And once the walk is over, you find yourself thinking of the next opportunity, the next occasion to be seen together in the bright but forgiving gaze of the public. If the stroll whets the appetite for more sustained togetherness, then the next setting is even more instructive. The dinner table, where knives and forks become instruments of impression and restraint. For all the words carefully arranged on paper, for all the steps taken side by side on gravel paths, there is a hunger for something more tangible. You can reread a letter until the ink begins to fade. You can replay the rhythm of a shared walk in your mind, but neither will sit in your pocket. For that, you need a token, something small, portable, and infused with sentiment. The Victorians, ever fond of symbolism and ceremony, made an art of exchanging trinkets. A token might be simple: a ribbon, a lock of hair, a pressed flower. These were not lavish gifts, but personal fragments. A ribbon tied around a letter could be tucked away in a drawer, its faint perfume clinging long after the scent of its owner had drifted. A lock of hair, carefully cut and braided, might be placed in a locket, pressed against the chest with every heartbeat. The intimacy is startling when you pause to consider it. Imagine carrying a literal piece of someone with you everywhere, both romantic and faintly unsettling. a little like taking your beloved's username and tattooing it on your arm in permanent ink. Flowers, too, were not just decorative. Victorians had entire dictionaries of floral meaning. A violet whispered modesty. A red rose declared passion. A forget-me-not begged remembrance. To the uninitiated, a bouquet was a bouquet. To the trained eye, it was a coded letter in color and petal. Delivering a daisy might seem innocent, but to someone fluent in floral language, it suggested loyalty, or depending on interpretation, cheerfully naive devotion. Of course, this system relied heavily on mutual understanding, which meant miscommunications were inevitable. One misplaced sprig of fennel could turn affection into an accidental insult. For those with deeper pockets, jewelry became the language of courtship. A cameo brooch, a delicate chain, a ring set with a modest stone, all signaled not only affection, but financial capacity. But even here, modesty ruled. Anything too gaudy risked whispers of vulgarity, while too simple a gift might suggest indifference. The balance was delicate. Show you cared, but not so extravagantly that it looked like bribery. A locket was ideal, especially one that could hold a miniature portrait or a strand of hair. It was a portable shrine to intimacy, nestled discreetly against the heart. These trinkets served another purpose. They survived absence. In a world without instant messages, where days or weeks might pass between visits, tokens filled the silence. You could touch the ribbon, open the locket, hold the flower, and feel tethered to someone not present. In quiet moments, when conversation dwindled or when doubts crept in, the trinket was proof. You were remembered. You matter. It was reassurance in physical form, fragile but powerful. Tokis also played well in the social theater of courtship. To be seen with a gift, however small, was a statement. A ribbon tucked into a gentleman's pocket or a trinket worn on a lady's dress could ignite speculation. Who gave it? And what does it mean? Society thrived on such whispered riddles. A visible token was both a comfort to the wearer and a silent advertisement to the world. Of course, not every token was immortal. Flowers wilted, ribbons frayed, hair discolored. Even jewelry could be lost in the shuffle of daily life. The impermanence was part of the charm. Token's fragility mirrored the uncertainty of love itself. Cherished, protected, but never guaranteed. A pressed flower fading in a book was both a memento and a reminder moments pass, even as memory lingers. And so you find yourself holding some small object, turning it over in your palm, attaching to it more meaning than any object should reasonably bear. It is not just a ribbon, not just a lock of hair, not just a flower. It is a declaration, a promise, an anchor. And if your heart quickens when you glance at it, then the token has done its work. Still, tokens can only whisper. For love to grow, there must be sound laughter. Melody, the clumsy strumming of emotions translated into notes. Which brings you naturally to the music room, where flirtation finds its rhythm. If tokens and trinkets are the sweet frosting of Victorian romance, etiquette is the dense sponge cake beneath it, impossible to avoid, a little heavy to chew, but essential to the structure. Love in the Victorian era was never a free-for-all. Every gesture, every phrase, every silence was hemmed in by rules. And unlike the lace collars and starched waistcoats, you couldn't take these rules off at the end of the evening. They were stitched into the very fabric of courtship. You quickly learn that saying nothing is often safer than saying the wrong thing. In the parlor, a gentleman may not address a young woman too directly unless formally introduced. A lady, meanwhile, must never appear overly eager. Enthusiasm risks looking like desperation. And desperation, of course, was a one-way ticket to social ruin. So you speak cautiously, circling your real feelings like a cat edging around a teapot. Careful not to knock it over. Careful not to draw too much attention. Physical contact is its own labyrinth. To us, a light touch on the arm seems unremarkable. To the Victorians, it was practically an act of rebellion. Gloves exist for a reason, not just to keep hands clean, but to filter out the scandal of skin meeting skin. A gloved hand on a sleeve is safe. A bare hand on a bare hand? Bold, risky, practically Shakespearean? Whole novels could hinge on such contact, with readers fanning themselves at the thought of fingertips brushing. Even walking out together, as you may recall, came with unspoken guidelines. Too long a stroll might raise eyebrows. Too frequent a stroll might ignite gossip. Heaven forbid the chaperone look away at the wrong moment. The rules were less about preventing affection and more about choreographing it, keeping everything in step with society's rhythm. Letters, too, followed etiquette. Ink blots aside, the wrong form of address could be catastrophic. Begin too formally, and you risk sounding indifferent. Begin too warmly, and you risk impropriety. Manuals of etiquette advised on acceptable closings, acceptable levels of metaphor, even acceptable folds of paper. Imagine being scolded because you folded your letter vertically instead of horizontally. It sounds absurd, but in the Victorian world, these details whispered volumes about your character. And then there was the omnipresent gaze of parents and guardians. They were not merely protectors. They were gatekeepers. A mother might watch conversations with the intensity of a hawk circling a field. A father might intercept a letter by accident. Even the servants, moving silently through parlors with trays and tea, were unofficial witnesses. Privacy was rare, which meant etiquette was a shield as much as a straitjacket. The strangest part, perhaps, is that everyone knew the rules, and everyone bent them anyway. A glance held a fraction too long, a phrase a shade too affectionate, a token given a moment too soon. All these tiny rebellions danced at the edge of etiquette. To live entirely within the rules would be suffocating. To break them entirely would be scandalous. The art was in walking the line, bending just enough to let romance slip through the cracks. And so you find yourself constantly negotiating how much to say, how much to hold back, when to lean on the safe phrases, when to risk a daring aside. It is a game, frustrating yet thrilling, where the stakes are your future and the prize is companionship. And if you ever doubt the seriousness of these rules, just remember, people wrote entire books explaining them, and people bought those books in droves. Still, rules only matter if there is something real trying to push against them. Etiquette is the fence, but what happens inside the garden is another matter, which is why the dance floor, with its whirl of music and motion, offered a place where rules bent just enough to let affection show through. If letters were too risky and words too carefully monitored, the Victorians turned to props. Objects ordinary, harmless, innocent-looking, became the language of flirtation. Chief among them were the fan and the flower. To the uninitiated, a lady fanning herself at a ball was simply warm, and a bloom pinned to a dress was simply decorative. But to those in the know, these gestures were secret telegrams of desire. Take the fan. A lady never went to a social gathering without one. On the surface, it cooled the cheeks, flushed from dancing, or fended off the stifling heat of a crowded ballroom. But in truth, the fan was a communication device, every bit as coded as Morse. To hold it closed and touch it to the right cheek meant yes, while the left cheek meant no. Opening and shutting it slowly might signal interest. A sharp snap shut might say, please, not now. Entire language of the fan manuals circulated, promising a dictionary of discreet gestures. Whether everyone took them seriously is another matter, but the fact remains. A folded paper on sticks could be as dangerous as a whisper. Then there were flowers. Victorians adored assigning meaning to petals. A red rose spoke of passion, as expected. A white rose murmured innocence. Daffodil suggested new beginnings, while a sprig of ivy pledged fidelity. Courtship bouquets became puzzles in ribbon and greenery. Receiving one was thrilling, decoding it was an exercise in patience, and misreading it could be catastrophic. Imagine being presented with a yellow carnation, meant to say rejection but mistaking it for cheerfulness. The romance ends before it even begins, all thanks to botany. Together, fans and flowers offered a way to flirt in plain sight. A woman could sit beside her mother, flutter her fan a certain way, and send a message across the room to her suitor without a word. A gentleman could pin a particular bloom to his lapel, silently declaring his intentions. To everyone else, these were just accessories. To the lovers, they were lifelines. Of course, like all secret codes, they were prone to failure. Fans slipped from hands, flowers wilted in the heat. Meanings shifted depending on which etiquette book you happened to own. And yet the beauty was in the attempt. The fragility of the gesture only heightened its charm. A smile could be misinterpreted. Fan could flutter too quickly. Flower could fade by night's end. Still, the effort spoke louder than certainty. You find yourself watching the fan movements, wondering, was that flutter intentional or just a draft from the open window? Did that rose mean devotion? Or did the florist simply have extras that day? The uncertainty is part of the fun. Flirtation thrives in ambiguity, and in the Victorian world, ambiguity was practically a pastime. And so, beneath the chandeliers and the music, a second, quieter performance unfolds. It is a performance only two people are meant to understand, though half the room is watching and whispering anyway. Love, in this form, is as delicate as lace fragile, easily torn, but breathtaking in its intricacy. Still, all the fans and flowers in the world are only gestures. At some point, courtship must be sanctioned by those who hold the real power, not the young couple themselves, but the families whose approval can make or break the romance. Which leads naturally to the solemn, sometimes daunting negotiations of parents and prospects. In a Victorian parlor, the piano was not just a piece of furniture. It was a stage, a spotlight, a test of character. Courtship often found its rhythm here, played out in hesitant chords and carefully chosen songs. You might think of it as the 19th century equivalent of curating a playlist, except there is no shuffle button. And mistakes are not hidden by algorithms but hang in the air, echoing against wallpaper and lace curtains. You sit in the parlor, watching as a young woman approaches the instrument. She smooths her skirts, adjusts her gloves, and places herself on the bench with the gravity of a priestess about to conduct a ritual. Fingers hover over ivory keys, and for a moment, the room holds its breath. The first note rings out clear, controlled, a declaration. With every chord, she is not simply playing music. She is demonstrating refinement, patience, discipline. These are not just songs, but coded reassurances. She has been properly educated, she is cultured, she can fill a home with grace. For the listener, the music becomes both entertainment and evaluation. You sit straighter, nodding appreciatively, though perhaps you wonder how many times she has practiced this very piece for this very occasion. Chopin, Mendelssohn, or perhaps a genteel English ballad, its own message. Too difficult, and it risks looking showy. Too simple, and it risks seeming dull. The balance, as always, is delicate. But beneath the polished notes lies something more playful. Music is one of the few areas where emotion may slip through the cracks of etiquette. A crescendo might suggest passion. A lingering pause on a minor chord might betray longing. Even a tiny fumble and extra beat of hesitation. A smile covering the mistake could feel more intimate than 100 polite bows. For the attentive suitor, these moments are treasure. Is that pause deliberate? Is that glance upward during the melody meant for you? Or just to check the lamps? Sometimes the piano becomes a duet. A gentleman may be invited cautiously, formulated to turn the pages of sheet music, or, more daring still, to take the second part of a four-handed piece. Here, proximity becomes scandalously close. Shoulders nearly touch, elbows brush, as fingers chase across keys. To the chaperone, it is music. To the participants, it is practically hand-holding in symphonic disguise. The rhythm of two sets of hands moving in unison is less about harmony on paper and more about the subtle harmony of two temperaments trying each other out. The instrument itself contributes to the atmosphere. Upright pianos stood proudly in countless middle-class homes, their polished wood gleaming, their presence as necessary as the family Bible. A silent piano was almost a shame. To gather guests and not open the lid was like hosting dinner without serving food. Music filled the awkward silences, softened the formality, and wrapped flirtation in acceptable culture. And for the performer, every note is a gamble. Strike the right tone, and admiration follows. Strike the wrong one, and you laugh it off with grace being the true test. After all, no one marries someone for flawless scales, but they might for the charm in recovering from them. The music lingers, not in perfection, but in the warmth it casts over the parlor. As the final notes fade, the room exhales. There is applause, polite but tinged with curiosity. You glance at the pianist, noting the flush on her cheeks, the way she smooths her gloves again. Perhaps she glances back, just once before lowering her gaze. What is a performance, yes, but also an offering. A piece of herself, translated into melody, left hovering in the parlor air. And as the evening drifts on, you realize music is not the end, but the bridge. From here, affection might spill into letters again, or tokens, or perhaps the next daring stage, being seen together at larger social gatherings, where the performance shifts from music to the subtle theater of public appearances. If the parlor piano was a stage for subtle expression, then the ballroom was the full theater, complete with lights, crowds, and the possibility of absolute triumph for social disaster. The dance floor, in Victorian society, was not just about rhythm and movement. It was a battleground where reputations were tested, alliances hinted at, and rivalries played out with all the elegance of silk gloves and polished shoes. You step into a ballroom, and the air is thick with candle smoke and perfume. A chandelier sways gently overhead, scattering light onto a sea of satin gowns and black tailcoats. A string orchestra tunes up in the corner, bowstrings squeaking politely, as if nervous about the spectacle they are about to accompany. This is not just a party. This is the social equivalent of a tournament. The prize? Affection? Approval? Perhaps even a marriage proposal tucked neatly into the season's schedule. On the surface, dancing looks like entertainment. But the truth is that each waltz, quadrille, or polka carries weight. To ask a lady to dance is to signal interest. To refuse is to risk offense. To misstep is to embarrass not only yourself, but also your partner, her family, and potentially her entire ancestry. In the Victorian world, dignity was fragile, and nothing threatened it more than two left feet. Imagine stepping onto the floor, gloves slightly damp, heart thumping louder than the bass of the cello. Your partner offers a gloved hand, and the ritual begins. If it is a waltz, the stakes rise dramatically. Only couples of some trust, or at least some daring, took the waltz together. For it required proximity that bordered on the indecent spinning, close enough that chaperones adjusted their spectacles and whispered furiously into fans. A successful waltz could feel intoxicating, as if the world had blurred away into a whirl of skirts and candlelight. A poorly executed one might leave you dizzy, apologetic, and socially bruised. Every step is a test. Are you graceful enough to guide without stumbling? Are you attentive enough to anticipate a turn? Are you charming enough to keep conversation flowing even while concentrating on your feet? The dance floor is unforgiving. Slip, and you are remembered for months. Shine, and your name might circulate in whispers long after the music stops. It is not only skill at stake, but strategy. Who you dance with, and how often, is tracked like military maneuvers. Too many dances with the same partner, and gossip brews. Too few, and you risk looking indifferent. Dance cards, those little booklets tied with ribbon, become maps of social conquest. Every filled line is a tiny victory. Every blank one, a small humiliation. You hold yours carefully as if it were a shield, and let us not forget the spectators. Those not dancing are observing, judging, tallying. Parents squint, calculating compatibility. Rivals whisper, hoping for a misstep. Friends cheer silently, rooting for your success. The floor may be filled with music, but it is also filled with scrutiny. Every glide, every bow, every turn of the wrist is weighed as part of your performance in the grand theater of courtship. Still, beneath the strategy and the nerves, there is magic. For a brief few minutes, the rules soften. You are close enough to speak softly without a chaperone overhearing. You may feel the fabric of a sleeve beneath your glove, or catch the sparkle in your partner's eyes as you spin. You might laugh, quietly, at the absurdity of it, all the sweat, the nerves, the calculation, yet in that moment, you are simply two people moving together in time. And when the music ends, the spell breaks. You bow, you curtsy, you thank each other with practiced poise. The orchestra shifts, and the next pair steps forward to wage their own polite battle. But you walk away changed, whether victorious, humiliated, or somewhere in between. For in the Victorian world, love was not won with grand declarations. Often, it was won in the subtle sway of a dance, in the courage to step onto the floor, and in the grace to survive it with dignity intact. From here, though, the battlefield shifts again. Beyond the whirl of music and gowns lies another arena, quieter but no less important. The gatherings and outings where couples are seen, not just by each other, but by society at large. The dance floor may have been a place of dazzling spins and whispered gossip, but the true test of Victorian courtship sometimes happened in the quiet creak of wheels on cobblestones. A carriage ride, simple as it sounds, carried with it dilemmas enough to make a general sweat. You find yourself at the threshold of one of these horse-drawn boxes, confronted with a choice that is less about comfort, and more about propriety, appearances, and the endless scrutiny of the world outside. The carriage itself is not grand to modern eyes, small, stuffy, and prone to drafts. The leather seats are polished but worn smooth by years of anxious visitors, each one shifting nervously as they rehearsed what to say and what not to do. The scent inside is a mix of horse, candle wax, the faint sweetness of perfume that lingers long after its owner has departed. It is not the romance of novels, though your imagination might try to convince you otherwise. The first dilemma, seating. If you are riding alone with a potential sweetheart, distance is both your ally and your obstacle. Too close, and tongues will wag before the horses even turn the corner. Too far, and the ride becomes a frozen exercise in polite awkwardness, as if two statues have been placed on opposite ends of a moving box. You must find the sweet spot close enough to converse without raising your voice, far enough to preserve the illusion of unshakable decorum. Conversation itself is another battlefield. The rumble of wheels and the occasional snort of the horse provide a soundtrack that makes silence louder than ever. You cannot fill the air with trivialities. Forever commenting on the weather only works for the first 2 minutes. And complimenting the upholstery feels more like a desperate reach than gallantry. Instead, you search for safe topics, weaving between the Scylla of too much intimacy and the Charybdis of unbearable boredom. Then there's the matter of windows. Leave the curtains open, and every passerby can see exactly who is sitting with whom. The ride becomes a traveling theater, with your lives on display for neighbors, acquaintances, and gossips lurking at lampposts. Close the curtains, however, and the imagination of society fills in the blanks with scandal far greater than reality. You sit there, debating silently whether to let the city watch you ride in mutual stiffness, or to grant them the delicious opportunity to invent tales far juicier than the truth. Option feels entirely safe. And what of the hands? The gloves you wear suddenly feel too tight, too obvious. If your fingers brush accidentally against your companion's, the air inside the carriage thickens, and you become acutely aware of every heartbeat. Such a moment, charged as it may feel to you, is dangerous if discovered. Victorian society had the peculiar talent of making a fleeting gesture seem like a full confession. One brush of fingertips could become, in the retelling, a torrid affair. Yet for all its pitfalls, the carriage ride holds possibilities. The world outside is noisy, bustling, judgmental, but inside, for a short stretch of road, you are cocooned together. You may share laughter over the absurd tilt of the driver's hat, or lean in slightly to catch a story as the clatter of hooves drowns your voices. In that rattling little box, you might find a rare space of near privacy, even if the city beyond is convinced it has caught you in the act of scandal. When the horses finally slow and the driver pulls the reins, relief mingles with regret. The ordeal has passed, your dignity hopefully still intact. You step out, arranging your expression into one of bland serenity, as though you had just been discussing the merits of wallpaper instead of wrestling with every inch of Victorian etiquette. But your challenges are not over. If the carriage ride is fraught, the family home that awaits is even more so. Their parents and guardians hover, watchful and exacting, ready to measure your words, your posture, and even the way you sip tea. If the carriage ride was a rickety arena of nerves and whispered suspicions, then stepping across the threshold of a Victorian family home is the equivalent of entering the true court of judgment. Forget the sideways looks of strangers on the street or the raised eyebrows of ballroom rivals. This is where the real verdict is handed down. For no matter how much charm you think you radiate, it is the parents, often stern-faced and eagle-eyed, who have the final say in whether your courtship blooms or withers like a rose left too long in a vase. You are ushered into a parlor already heavy with the scent of over-polished wood and tea that has been steeping since dawn. The mother, perhaps, sits with a straight back, hands folded like a queen on a throne, her expression kind but alert. The father may lurk behind a newspaper, pretending to read but never missing a flicker of your gestures. Even the siblings, those supposed allies, hover like mischievous spies, ready to report every stumble and hesitation. You are not just meeting a family, you are auditioning for a role in their entire household. And the critics are merciless. The ordeal begins with conversation. Do you speak too freely? Then you risk being seen as rash. Too little? Then you are dull, perhaps lacking ambition. Each word is weighed as though placed on a set of scales. A compliment about them may win a smile unless it is too effusive, in which case it feels like flattery. Commenting on the weather is safe, though dull unless you say too much, in which case you sound like a farmer with no imagination. Navigating small talk in this parlor is like crossing a tightrope suspended over a pit of gossip. And then comes the subtle interrogation. Where do you work? How much do you earn? What family do you come from? The questions may be framed with polite smiles, but the stakes are unmistakably high. It is not your heart they are interested in, but your prospects. Romance is all very well, but stability, money, connections, reputation, that is the true coin of Victorian marriage markets. You smile, you answer, and you pray you sound respectable enough without appearing boastful. The true test, however, lies not in your answers, but in your composure. Can you sip tea without clattering the cup against the saucer? Can you sit without slouching, yet without looking as stiff as the furniture itself? Can you compliment the mother's roses without appearing to ignore the father's prized cigar collection? Every tiny detail is a note in the symphony of approval, and one sour chord may linger in their minds long after you've departed. Even if you pass their tests with grace, there is always the silent verdict you will not hear until much later, whispered between parents after the door is closed. Approval, in this era, is rarely expressed to your face. Instead, it travels in the quiet currents of household discussion. Seemed polite enough, his shoes were scuffed. She laughed too loudly, or he showed promise. Though I'm not convinced, the outcome is uncertain, and you will only feel it later in the warmth or chill of future invitations. Yet approval is not only a barrier, it is also a bridge. If you succeed, if the mother warms to your manners and the father nods in grudging respect, then your path is suddenly smoother. Invitations to dinner appear. Conversations stretch longer. The parlor becomes less a courtroom and more a familiar gathering place. And with that, your chances of advancing the romance grow considerably. Still, one cannot live forever in the scrutiny of parents and teacups. The true test of Victorian courtship lies in how do people communicate when not under such direct surveillance. When trust is built away from the stern gaze of the family. And so, after enduring the ordeal of approval, the natural next step moves to something quieter, subtler, and infinitely more delicate. The art of managing whispers and secrecy. If parental approval is the gatekeeper of Victorian romance, then secrecy is the escape hatch, because no matter how many polite parlor visits you endure, or how often you survive the silent judgment of teacups and raised eyebrows, there comes a moment when you long for something unscripted. And so, tucked within the rigid skeleton of etiquette, many a Victorian romance beat with a secret heart. The art of slipping away, of arranging clandestine encounters, became as much a skill as learning to dance a quadrille. Picture yourself in the drawing room of some well-appointed house. Seated at a proper distance from your intended, a chaperone stationed nearby with the watchfulness of a prison guard. Words feel rehearsed, movements stiff, laughter carefully measured, and yet beneath the calm surface an unspoken plan may be simmering. A shared glance toward the French doors, a folded scrap of paper with a time hastily scrawled, the faintest tilt of a fan that means more than entire sonnets. Every proper household had its cracks, and lovers learned how to slip through them. A carriage ride could be arranged under the guise of visiting a cousin. A trip to the conservatory might involve more lingering than botanical study. Even something as ordinary as a Sunday stroll could become an adventure, provided you chose the right winding path away from the main promenade. The thrill lay not only in the company, but in the risk. Every encounter carried with it the possibility of discovery, and discovery meant scandal. In an era where gossip traveled faster than railways, scandal was a heavy price to pay. Still, secrecy had its intoxicating rewards. Imagine the rustle of skirts as you step into a dimly lit garden, the cold bite of the night air carrying the scent of damp earth and roses. The city hums faintly in the distance, but here, in the shadows, there is space to breathe, to laugh freely, to share words that would never survive the polite suffocation of the parlor. Even a short walk down a darkened lane could feel like liberation, a moment stolen back from the relentless performance of Victorian courtship. Yet escapes were rarely without obstacles. Carriages rattled loudly enough to betray their presence. Neighbors lingered at windows with nothing better to do than speculate. Even the family's maid, supposedly discreet, could wield knowledge like a dagger if she chose. One slip of the tongue, one poorly timed return, and the whole delicately balanced secrecy could collapse. What was meant to be a private meeting in the conservatory could reappear the next day as hushed laughter at the market or a pointed comment from a family friend. And so secrecy was a game of balance. Too many chance encounters and suspicion thickened. Too few, and the connection withered under the weight of distance. Lovers became strategists, calculating opportunities as carefully as generals plotting campaigns. Sometimes, letters smuggled under flower pots or slipped discreetly into hymnals served as the bridge between meetings. Other times, sheer boldness carried the day an escape made with the excuse of fetching a shawl, only to return with cheeks flushed from more than the chill of the evening air. For all its dangers, there was something undeniably romantic about these escapes. They lent a pulse to courtship, otherwise drowned in etiquette. They reminded you that beneath the polished shoes, the high collars, and the ever-watchful society, there were still two human beings daring to carve out a small patch of freedom. To share a secret was, in its own way, a declaration. A promise that what you felt mattered enough to risk whispers and raised brows. Of course, whispers and raised brows were never far behind. Every secret meeting risked feeding the most voracious beast of Victorian society gossip. And gossip, once loosed, could not easily be reined back in. But before we step into that noisy arena, let us pause here in the quiet garden, in the hush of the carriage ride, in the stillness of a conservatory. After dark, and savored the thrill of what it meant to steal a moment for yourself. After months, perhaps years, of carefully orchestrated parlor visits. Nerve-rattling dances, carriage rides balanced on the knife edge of scandal, and secret meetings conducted in the shadows. There comes a turning point in Victorian courtship: the proposal. To modern sensibilities, it might seem straightforward, a simple question, a ring, a yes or no. But in the Victorian world, nothing was simple, and the engagement ritual was less a private moment of intimacy than a public declaration, wrapped tightly in layers of etiquette and expectation. You might imagine a quiet walk in a garden, a whispered question, and a heart-racing reply. Sometimes it did unfold that way. But more often the proposal was entangled with parental negotiations, family reputations, and the invisible hand of social calculation. The suitor, before even daring to propose, was expected to secure the father's blessing. This could mean an evening of solemn conversation in the study, the smell of pipe smoke heavy in the air, while the hopeful young man outlined not only his feelings but also his income, his profession, and the stability of his household. Love was never irrelevant, but it was rarely the deciding factor. If the father approved, then and only then could the suitor approach the young woman herself. Even then, the moment was not always entirely private. Chaperones hovered just out of sight, and the proposal itself often followed the well-rehearsed script of Victorian sentiment. Words of devotion, promises of loyalty, and above all, a guarantee of security. To modern ears, it might sound more like a business contract than a romantic vow. But in an age where marriage determined one's entire future, romance and practicality were two threads of the same fabric. The engagement ring added its own layer of symbolism. By the mid-19th century, diamonds were becoming fashionable, but many rings bore other stones: sapphires, rubies, emeralds often chosen for their supposed meanings. A pearl might symbolize purity, a garnet fidelity, a sapphire constancy. The band itself was typically gold, simple but sturdy, as if to reassure everyone that this promise was as unbreakable as the metal itself. The ring was more than jewelry. It was a public marker, a small piece of metal that shouted loudly, "Taken once, accepted." The engagement spread through the social web like wildfire. Families announced it in newspapers. Friends passed the news in hushed but excited tones, and the couple found themselves suddenly transformed. No longer merely suitor and sweetheart, They were now betrothed, the status that carried both privileges and new constraints. They could spend more time together, speak more freely, perhaps even sit a little closer without scandal. But the weight of expectation pressed heavier than ever. A broken engagement was a serious stain on reputation, often harder to bear than never having been engaged at all. Engagement gifts became another layer of ritual. A young man might present a bracelet or locket, while the young woman sometimes gave her a token in return, perhaps a handkerchief embroidered with her initials or a portrait miniature to keep in his pocket. These gifts were small, but carried immense symbolic weight, reinforcing the seriousness of the commitment. Even the simplest trinket could become a relic of devotion, treasured for years, or, if things soured, quietly hidden away in drawers never opened. And of course, the couple themselves had to adapt to their new role. No longer were they figures of speculation at balls, or the subject of sly remarks during carriage rides. Now, they were openly on the path to marriage, and every glance, every gesture, every outing was measured against this new identity. People watched closely for signs. Was the bride to be suitably modest and prepared for her new responsibilities? Was the groom steady, hardworking, ready to provide? The engagement was not the end of scrutiny, but simply a shift in its angle. For the young lovers, however, the ritual held its own sweetness. Beneath all the ceremony, the rules, the negotiations, there was still the quiet thrill of knowing they had crossed a threshold together, that the whispered promises, the stolen glances, the carefully folded notes had led to something tangible. The ring on her hand was not only a social contract, but also a small symbol of victory, of perseverance through the exhausting maze of Victorian courtship. Yet as the excitement of engagement settled, another trial loomed on the horizon. For if engagements were complicated, weddings were an entire universe of ritual, spectacle, and expectation. And so, the courtship story marched inevitably toward its climax. The grand ceremony of union itself. Even in the midst of candlelit ballrooms, parlor flirtations, and the trembling drama of carriage rides, you cannot forget that many Victorian romances were not entirely the work of two people's hearts. Hovering somewhere in the background, often invisible, but always influential, was the matchmaker's hand. Sometimes this hand belonged to an aunt who knew everyone's business, sometimes to a family friend who loved a bit of scheming, sometimes to society itself, nudging and steering with its endless rules. Love in the Victorian era was rarely just about two souls colliding. It was also about careful arrangement, introductions at just the right time, and a quiet orchestration that made meetings feel natural when, in truth, they had been set up like chess pieces weeks in advance. Imagine being invited to a dinner, believing it to be a simple evening of soup, roast beef, and polite conversation. Then you notice that you've been seated directly across from a certain someone. Coincidence, hardly. The hostess, perhaps your mother, perhaps a friend of your mother, has carefully arranged the seating, ensuring that elbows touch during the soup course, that smiles are exchanged between bites of pudding. By dessert, everyone else at the table is happily talking of politics and poetry, while you are caught in the quiet, deliberate snare of engineered proximity. Sometimes the matchmaker was more direct. Letters might arrive suggesting that it would be pleasant if you attended a picnic or a country outing, knowing full well who else had been invited. Carriage rides could be organized with suspiciously few available seats, forcing you to sit where you were meant to. Even a casual stroll in a park might feel suspiciously well-timed, as if fate had suddenly grown a very human hand guiding your path. Fate, in this case, often wore a bonnet and carried a parasol. Of course, matchmaking was not merely the pastime of meddlesome relatives. It was a social duty. Families looked to one another, considering alliances that could strengthen reputation, wealth, or influence. A match was a negotiation, and the matchmaker acted as the diplomat, smoothing introductions, arranging circumstances, making sure no one appeared too eager while ensuring no one lost interest. Subtlety was the craft. To push too hard was to ruin the illusion of spontaneity, but to do nothing was to leave the future at chance's mercy. And not all matchmakers were entirely benevolent. Sometimes there was pressure, gentle at first, then firmer. A whisper of this would be a good match for the family, or he has prospects, you mustn't overlook them, carried weight. The young were not always free agents, and many found themselves nudged, coaxed, or outright steered into unions that looked perfect on paper. Even if they left little room for affection, your heart might yearn elsewhere, but the invisible hand of arrangement had a way of tightening around your sleeve. Yet oddly enough, matchmaking did not always kill romance. Sometimes it made it possible. In an age where propriety prevented open flirtation, where strict chaperones curtailed freedom, and where chance meetings were rare, the matchmaker's quiet engineering created opportunities that otherwise might never have existed. A walk, a conversation, a shared laugh, all of these could blossom into something genuine, even if the seeds were planted by someone else's design. The hand that arranged the first step did not always control the ones that followed. You find yourself wondering as you sip carefully at a cup of tea in yet another orchestrated gathering. How much of your romance belongs to you, and how much to the gentle nudges of others? Was it fate? Was it planning? Or was it simply the Victorian way that love was never a solitary endeavor, but a community project disguised as destiny? Whatever the answer, the matchmaker's hand was always there. Invisible yet insistent, turning the gears of society so that two people might find themselves side by side. And once that hand had done its work, it retreated, leaving you with the far more complicated task of sustaining affection in a world where gossip, duty, and expectation never quite left you alone. Of course, matchmaking was only one force shaping love in the Victorian era. The other, equally relentless, was society itself. The chatter, the whispers, the judgment, which is where the story of romance must inevitably wander next. At last, after months sore, perhaps years of carefully orchestrated meetings, stolen glances, polite letters, and the occasional crisis over whether your beloved's hand lingered a fraction too long on yours, the day arrives. The wedding. In the Victorian era, this was not merely a personal milestone. It was a performance, a spectacle in which the bride, groom, and their families were less participants in a private union than actors in a public play staged for society's approval. From the moment the engagement was announced, expectations began to build. A Victorian wedding was less about quiet romance and more about confirming alliances, displaying prosperity, and proving to the world that all had been done properly. Even those of modest means found themselves swept into the current of tradition. For to skip too many steps was to invite gossip, and gossip could be as dangerous as any rival suitor. You might imagine the preparations first. The bride's gown white, of course, though this had only recently become the fashion after Queen Victoria herself wore white in 1840. Before her, brides wore their best dress, regardless of color. But now white was the standard, and to appear in anything else was to look unfashionable, even defiant. So the gown was sewn, often with painstaking embroidery, sometimes trimmed with lace that represented countless hours of work. Gloves, veils, shoes all, carefully chosen. And if you were fortunate, a sprig of orange blossom might be woven into the ensemble, a delicate symbol of purity and fertility. The groom, meanwhile, had rather fewer options. His task was simple: look respectable. A dark suit, polished shoes, a clean shave, and perhaps a flower pinned to the lapel. If he appeared solemn and serious, so much the better. After all, matrimony was considered less a giddy adventure than a sober duty, something to be entered with dignity and restraint. Smiling too much was considered frivolous. The ceremony itself often took place in a church, attended by family, friends, and a scattering of neighbors who had little connection to the couple, but every connection to the thrill of local spectacle. You would stand beneath stained glass, the air thick with candle smoke and perfume. While a clergyman intoned words about vows and virtue, the ritual was familiar, repeated countless times across countless towns. Yet each repetition carried its own electric tension. You were stepping into a role that society had rehearsed for you long before you were born. Afterward came the wedding breakfast. Do not picture a modest morning meal. Despite its name, this was a feast, ranging from roasted meats to jellied delicacies. Cakes piled high with sugar icing, and wine enough to toast until voices grew loud. The centerpiece, of course, was the wedding cake. In wealthy households, these became elaborate constructions of fruitcake and sugar, so dense and heavily iced they could survive decades if preserved. Guests were sometimes given tiny slices wrapped in paper to take home, to dream upon at night in the hope of envisioning their own future spouse. Congratulations, your leftovers now doubled as magical fortune-telling devices. But beyond food and flowers, the true spectacle of a Victorian wedding lay in appearances. It was not just about two people becoming one, but about families displaying themselves to the community. Every detail, the gown's stitching, the carriage's polish, the guest list spoke volumes. To be invited was an honor. To be excluded was an insult. To appear to lavish risked accusations of vanity. To appear to modest risked whispers of financial trouble. It was a tightrope, and you walked it dressed in your very finest. And always there was the press of eyes, the relentless observation. Even in small villages, tongues wagged. Did the bride look pale? Was the groom sufficiently attentive? Did the families behave with proper cordiality? In grander circles, newspapers might even publish descriptions, turning what was meant to be the union of two hearts into fodder for public consumption. Privacy was a luxury few enjoyed on such a day. Still, beneath all the performance there lingered moments of intimacy, a hand clasped in the carriage after the ceremony, a whispered joke during the endless line of congratulations, the simple relief that, at last, ritual was complete and the two of you could begin the quieter, less observed business of being married. These flashes of humanity glowed against the backdrop of formality, tiny sparks of real affection hidden inside the spectacle. As the last crumbs of cake were swept away and the carriages rolled off into the night, you might wonder how different your new life would be from the one before. But there was no time for such musings at the feast. The wedding was not the end of the performance. It was only the beginning. For now came the honeymoon, that peculiar Victorian invention where the couple set off on yet another journey, this time not through the parlor or ballroom, but across landscapes, seas, and unfamiliar towns, in search of privacy that society had denied them. When the last wedding carriages rolled away, when the lace is folded and the flowers have withered into memory, you find yourself reflecting. What was Victorian love really? It was many things at once, part tender, part strategic, part suffocating under rules, and yet somehow still alive with small sparks of rebellion and warmth. Looking back, you see it less as a single story and more as a collection of overlapping performances. Some orchestrated by family, some dictated by etiquette, and just a few shaped by the beating of two uncooperative hearts. You'll recall how every step of the process came with layers of ritual. The calling card slipped discreetly onto a silver tray, the parlor conversations framed by hovering chaperones, the long walks where silence carried more meaning than a dozen flowery speeches. Love was not shouted in the Victorian age. It was whispered, coded, concealed behind fans and folded letters. If you were lucky, you learned to read those codes, to spot the signal hidden in a glance or a gesture. 8. If you were unlucky, you spent years mistaking polite interest for passion and passion for politeness. The Victorians, it seems, believed that love could not be left entirely to chance. Too much was at stake. Family honor, financial stability, the delicate machinery of reputation. Romance, therefore, was treated like a fragile artifact, handled with gloves, polished until it gleamed, displayed in just the right light. And yet, despite all this management, love still managed to slip through cracks. In secret letters, in hurried carriage rides, in reckless decisions that made mothers pale and fathers sigh, real affection bloomed in unexpected corners. The rules were strict, but hearts were stubborn. You could almost hear the texture of those years. The rustle of silk dresses brushing across polished floors. The scratching of a pen on thick, creamy paper as someone agonizes over just the right way to write yours sincerely. The faint tap of shoes on a gravel path during a supervised walk, where every step feels like an act of both obedience and resistance. The clink of teacups in parlors where futures are quietly negotiated, with you sitting politely in the center like an exhibit on display. There was humor, too, even if the Victorians themselves did not always see it. A fan held at just the wrong angle, a letter smudged with ink and nerves, a dance partner who accidentally treads on your foot in front of everyone. These small embarrassments remind you that beneath all the layers of etiquette, the Victorians were simply people trying, in their own careful way, to connect. Their love was not so different from yours, only dressed in stricter clothing and observed by far too many relatives. When you look back, you also see the contradictions. Love was idealized as pure, spiritual, almost untouchable, and yet marriages were often weighed down by contracts and calculations. Publicly, the age spoke of moral virtue, while privately it whispered about scandal and temptation. Courtship could be a gentle game of patience, or it could be a battlefield of reputations. Somehow, both could be true at once. And in the end, perhaps the spectacle of Victorian love was less about the individuals and more about the story it told to everyone watching. Two families joined, two lives bound, as an image presented to society that said, order is preserved, propriety is upheld, the dance continues. Whether the marriage itself was filled with warmth or coldness, laughter or silence, was often known only to those inside it. Society cared more for appearances than for happiness. Looking back, you can't help but feel a strange mixture of admiration and relief. Admiration for the discipline, the patience, the way people crafted meaning out of glances and gestures instead of grand declarations. Relief that you do not have to survive a courtship conducted under the perpetual supervision of a dozen eyes and the weight of half a dozen rule books. Love, then and now, may never be simple, but at least you are free to trip over your words without an entire neighborhood drawing conclusions. And so you close the curtain on Victorian romance, a world of lace and ink blots, of dances and chaperones, of duty dressed up as passion and passion disguised as duty. You leave it behind with a gentle smile, knowing that even in an age of strict rules, love still found ways to bloom, awkward and imperfect, but real nonetheless. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the Victorian heart. No matter how many hands tried to shape it, love still insisted on being itself. And so we gently close the curtain on Victorian love. You've walked through parlors heavy with silence, carried calling cards like little passports to affection, and leaned in to catch whispers that never dared to be spoken outright. You felt the weight of etiquette pressing down, and you've seen how, despite it all, love still found its way sometimes neatly, often awkwardly, always human. As you lie here now, perhaps under the steady hum of a fan or the comfort of soft blankets, you can be grateful that your own heart is not bound by quite so many rules. You don't need a silver tray to announce your interest, or a chaperone hovering nearby to approve your conversations. Yet the Victorians remind us of something enduring, that love adapts. It bends around rules, slips through cracks, survives in coded gestures, and in stolen moments. In their world, every fan flutter and ink blot carried weight. In yours, it may be a text message, a nervous pause, or a glance across a crowded room. Different tools, same old longing. The human story, stretching quietly across centuries, always returns to the same truth, that connection matters more than the rules written to contain it. So let your mind soften now. Leave behind the carriages and corsets, the parlors and pianofortes. Imagine the faint echo of a waltz fading into silence, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. You are safe, you are warm. Tomorrow will arrive soon enough. For now, rest, sleep well, and dream gently.